perhaps instead of looking for a cool church, young people are looking for a warm church. And the great news about that is that any church can be warm. And any generation, any aged person can be warm. It's about making space in our lives for other people. It's about taking time to hear people's stories and to make them feel welcomed and embraced.
Hello and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Julie Henson, and I'm one of the associate pastors here at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me today is one of our other associate pastors, Josh Fitzpatrick. How's it going?
I'm doing well. It just occurred to me that might be one of the first times I've heard you say your last name.
That's one of the first times I've said it out loud.
How's that feel?
It was really weird.
It's official, Julie Henson.
Yeah.
I like it.
I do too. I think we'll stick with it.
Good. So, we're approaching Easter, and I'm kind of curious, do you have any Easter traditions in your family?
Yeah, so we always did the traditional Easter egg hunt, and, we would wake up on Easter morning, and there was an Easter basket full of candy and goodies there. I do remember, though, out at the farm out in East Texas, I have all boy cousins, and so we always did a big Easter egg hunt out on the farm, and we did that until I was 16, and I was one of the youngest.
Wow.
And so, it got pretty dangerous for a while because we got pretty intense with our Easter egg hunting. It was a lot of fun.
Now, when you woke up in the morning, was your basket just sitting there?
Yes.
Okay, so my family had this, maybe it's a tradition other families do, I don't know, but for some reason, the basket was always hidden, and it wasn't hidden in the house. We lived kind of in the country as well. And they would always be hidden somewhere in our giant yard.
Oh.
And we weren't even able to go find them until we were all dressed up in our Easter clothes. So here we were tromping around the bushes in our Easter outfits, looking for our Easter basket. And as we got older, the hiding spots would get more and more difficult, and we find ourselves on the roof of our house and climbing up trees. It was pretty awesome.
That sounds pretty fun. So were there eggs in the basket once you found it, or did you have to find the basket then the eggs?
The baskets in the morning were always filled with candy and goodies and stuff. And then we do like a egg hunt after church in the afternoon. Yeah. It's a good tradition. So this Saturday is the annual egg hunt here at our church, First United Methodist Church, Richardson, and this will be my first time at it. I'm excited to bring our kids to it and experience the joy of the egg hunt here.
Yeah, we promise not to hide any baskets on the roof.
Okay, good. One of the reasons I'm really looking forward to the Easter egg hunt this year at our church is it shows the priority we place on families and children and youth. And we're really excited today to have a conversation on that topic about what it means when a church takes seriously the life of youth and children in everything they do. So today we're happy to welcome to the show Brad Griffin. This morning, it's our pleasure to introduce to you and welcome to the show Brad Griffin, who is the director of Fuller Youth Institute in Pasadena, California. Welcome to the show, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure completely. We're excited to chat with you this morning. For the sake of our audience and also for our own sake, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role with the Fuller Youth Institute?
Yeah, sure thing. Been in ministry for a couple decades, mostly with young people, and I've served here at the Fuller Youth Institute for the past 13 years. We're a research and resourcing arm of Fuller. We just want to help tackle people's toughest questions about young people and faith. We work with leaders, we work with parents, we work with people of all kinds who care about teenagers and emerging adults, and especially care about helping them follow Jesus well in today's world.
So, Brad, why youth? Where does your passion for youth come from?
Yeah, such a great question. In my own life, well, that shifted over time. Today my first answer is I have two teenagers and a preteen in my own home. And I think about these realities a lot. I think about the way that, what it's like to be a young person today, what it's like to raise them, what it's like to navigate their world. These are everyday in and out questions, but it's been a passion that really since when I was in college, I began to be interested in working with those just a little bit younger than me, and have just spent my life interested in questions of what's it like to be an adolescent, what's it like to grow up in particular in our culture, but also just young people around the world. It's such a malleable season of life. And I think there's something about that that is just really intriguing. And also a phase of life that, to be honest, once we're past it, a lot of us don't want to look back and we don't want to get near it. So, I think of middle schoolers in particular, a lot of people don't like to work with middle schoolers. I think it's because we don't want to remember the, maybe traumatic experiences we had in that phase of life. Yeah, really. Once we move past it, we kind of shut it off. And I just want to invite all adults to be brave and, to re-enter the world of young people, because they need us. They need us in those spaces.
I find that we often, regardless of time or how much time has passed, we find ourselves saying kids these days, just as sort of categorically like, oh, kids these days, as if they are so much worse now than they used to be. Over your career in youth ministry and working specifically with youth, what are some of the things that you've seen that have changed about our youth, and maybe some things that haven't, that are just sort of universally true for that age and demographic?
Yeah, those phrases we use are really interesting. They're phrases that help us distance ourselves. And what's fascinating is, one of the things I've seen is there was a lot of obsession over millennials and a lot of worry about, the millennials and, they're so this or so that. And what's interesting now is people will use that as kind of a stand-in phrase, for, kids these days, those millennials. Well, millennials are about to turn 40, so they're no longer the kids.
Yeah.
Today's kids are a new generation. They're being called a lot of things, most commonly Gen Z now. And they are the young people who are kids and teenagers and who are emerging into, now just graduating from high school and moving into young adulthood. And it's interesting to see, certainly there are things that stay the same. I think some of what stays the same is the big questions that young people are wrestling with in this phase, primarily questions around identity, belonging, and purpose. Who am I? Where do I fit? Who are my people? And how will my life matter in the world? How do my actions matter? What does it mean to be a person who's alive and contributing to the world right now? I think those questions remain. I think the ways that young people wrestle with them and are taught and guided to wrestle with them shift dramatically. Certainly, one of the biggest areas of progressive change, just ongoing evolution in what it means to be a young person today, is around technology, and in particular the digital world that most of us who are adults now did not grow up in a hyper-connected world.
Right.
We grew up in an analog world, and it has been a dramatic shift in the way that young people are growing up and the way they're experiencing life and reality and relationships, and every aspect of who they are is shaped unmistakably by digital technology. And I think, one of the greatest challenges of our day is to walk alongside them in that and not shame them for the only world they've ever known by using phrases like kids these days, or, well, when I was your age. When I was your age rarely precedes an empathetic response to a young person in front of us. And what they need are people who are willing to step in and say, hey, I don't understand everything about your world, but I want to walk with you through it. Help me understand, show me, tell me more about what you're experiencing and what that's like. Because underneath some of that, just to take social media, for example, underneath a lot of the things we see and may not understand about young people in social media are some of the big questions that we can relate to. Gosh, who am I? Who am I in relation to others? How am I going to work out, the experiment of my identity? And for today's kids and teenagers, there's just that added layer of working it out in a much more public, much more connected way than most of us experienced.
Brad, so I'm the dad of 3 kids. I've got a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And the idea of my kids growing up in a digital age terrifies me, quite frankly.
Yeah, most
of
us.
One of the goals of Fuller Youth Institute, I think, is to equip those of us who feel like we are not in the know. You put out a ton of literature and books, and one of those books is called Every Parent's Guide to Navigating Our Digital World. So what do you say to a parent? I'm not a parent of a teenager yet, but someday I will be there. What do you say to those parents who just are terrified and asking, how in the world do I keep my kids safe?
Yeah. First off, we have good reason to be scared. Certainly we're seeing in the news day after day that we have reason to be concerned about our safety. There's plenty that we're not, as adults, paying attention to that we maybe should be paying attention to. And fear doesn't always get us very far. Fear is not a very great motivator, and certainly it's not a great parenting tactic. So just trying to frighten our kids in order to maybe bring them in line or use technology responsibly is not our most effective tool. And so, one of the best tools we have is conversation. And the thing that I say to parents a lot is, we can put a lot of systems and structures in place, and we absolutely should, internet filters and device monitors and these structures that can help us. But sometimes we put those in place and we let that do all of the regulation for us, and we miss the more important piece of just talking about it, talking about our values around not just technology and technology use, but the kinds of things we interact with and the people we interact with. Talking about, here are some situations you might experience as a kid in digital spaces. Talking about a protocol for, hey, when this happens, here's what to do. Talking about all these different layers in ways that our kids feel comfortable and safe coming to us first when they experience something uncomfortable. Because when a kid experiences fear or shame around their interactions with technology, then when something happens, when they get approached or something strange happens or something pops up that makes them uncomfortable or is clearly inappropriate, the first thing that they might feel is fear of punishment and shame for having done something wrong, even if that really wasn't their fault or their prompting at all. So keeping those lines of communication open from an early age is really, really important. And to say, hey, in these digital spaces, there are people who may not have your best interest at heart. There may be people who are scary strangers who approach you, in the same way that we talk about that in live situations. So keeping the conversation open. And then into the teen years, sometimes we feel like if we put enough monitors on their devices, that's going to substitute for real conversations. We cannot substitute for real conversations around sexuality and sexual ethics and pornography. We cannot substitute for real conversations around relationships and resolving conflict. I have, my middle child is 13, and we have conversations with her about, hey, you can't resolve conflict by text message. That's not a very effective way to resolve conflict with other 13-year-olds. So, these are the things that we have to be actively talking about. And technology doesn't substitute for that in any way.
Brad, you've said so much that I want to touch on. I keep thinking about my brothers who are quite a bit younger than me. So I'm 30, just turned 30 this year. My older brother is 33. Then my younger brothers are 22 and 17. And so we span these generations, and there's a lot of things that we have in common, but in terms of communication and how we see the world, I'm always sort of trying to find a better way to communicate, especially with my youngest brother, because he's lived in a world, he was born in 2001, he's lived in a world that has always been digital. And so I love what you've said about communication and about the ways in which we can keep those lines open and stay more connected. So one of the things that y'all emphasize at the Fuller Youth Institute is intergenerational ministry. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is so important?
Yeah, well, about a dozen years ago, we began a series of studies that resulted in some work that we called sticky faith, because the core question was around how do we help young people carry faith with them into young adulthood. And particularly coming out of some statistics that are pretty dire that showed that around 1 out of 2 students who are part of churches and families who follow Jesus walk into young adulthood and walk away from their faith. And we wanted to address that, but part of how we wanted to address it was to learn, what can churches do? What can families do? What can any adult who cares about kids do to help foster faith? And one of the early and consistent surprises and reinforcements through that research was the power of intergenerational community in creating that kind of lasting faith. And as we begin to explore it, we learn more and more that, over the past handful of decades, we've created a lot of children's ministry and youth ministry models that are based around pulling kids out of connection with adults and into age-specific and often age-segregated programming. And, the better we get at that, the more professional we've become at that in our churches, the more we've created environments where it's not uncommon for a kid to participate in a church and never interact with adults other than paid staff and ministry volunteers in their age level ministry. And what we realized in some of our research is some of those who were really sticking with faith had some different experiences. They may have had age level programming, but they also had intergenerational connections. They worshiped with adults in their community. They had mentoring relationships. They had relationships with at least one other adult outside of the youth ministry who was just someone who was part of the church and stayed connected with them. And those kinds of relationships are really key in helping a young person develop a sense of being part of a community. We call the church the body of Christ. This is biblical imagery that Paul uses. And this imagery is really important for us to consider when we think about our programming. That age level programming is so important for so many things, but it should not substitute for connection and relationship with the broader body. And part of that is the way that kids and teenagers see themselves as useful and wanted contributors to the body. When they sense that, really we just want them out of the way and we want them to be entertained and to have their own thing, they don't sense that they're needed, that they have a role to play. And this was a link between our sticky faith research and our more recent research of churches growing young, churches engaging young people really well in adolescence and emerging adulthood. And one of the really important factors there was that young people realize they're prioritized in church communities when they have a load-bearing role to play. When they have this sense that, this church couldn't go on without me.
Yeah.
Like, I have a really important role here. I matter in some really significant ways. This church needs me because they need me to participate in worship. They need me to serve. They need me to be part of the body in a living and active and ongoing way. And I think a lot of kids don't really feel that way about church. A lot of teenagers, they don't have that experience. And so why would they go into young adulthood with any sense of connection or contribution to church when all that's happened their entire life is a consumer experience, or an entertainment experience, or we hope you enjoy the program we put on for you? That's a very, very different sense than, gosh, if I wasn't part of this, it wouldn't go on.
Brad, I love that. I remember one of the courses I took while I was at Fuller was from Chap Clark, and he talked about that segregation of generations as a one-eared Mickey Mouse. The main church family is the big circle of Mickey Mouse's face, and then you have that totally separated, self-sustaining ear that is the youth ministry. And it becomes so professionalized that we train up our youth leaders to be leaders of youth, and then they have no bridge into the congregation. So when you talk about empowering youth to have a contributing role in the church family, I just think that's crucial. What it also occurs to me, though, is what you're just saying about church having to take maybe a more humble stance in the way it operates as not just a venue of entertainment or professionalism, but if we're going to empower youth, we might have to say, well, you know what? That might be at the expense of some excellence that could be, but if it means that this teenager stays in the church, then it's worth everything. Could you tell a little bit about this other change that you've discussed in some of your literature about churches not needing to be the coolest church or the most professional, but providing a warm environment instead?
Yeah, well, often one of the myths that surrounds youth ministry in particular is, we really have to have a cool youth ministry. We need maybe a young, hip youth pastor, an entertaining program. We need to sort of attract young people in these ways. And some of what we found in our research of studying churches that are thriving, and they're thriving with young people, we didn't see a lot of evidence of that kind of model playing out. We certainly met some cool people. We met some hip leaders, but what we found by and large was a consistent factor that was a little different, and that was warmth. In our research with over 1,300 people who were part of churches growing young, one of the most consistent phrases we heard people use to describe their church was like family. This church is like my family. This is my family here. These people are my family. We're just family here. That kind of phrase we heard over and over and over. And we began to explore that alongside some other terms like authenticity and acceptance. And we began to put together what we called a warmth cluster. And we found that perhaps instead of looking for a cool church, young people are looking for a warm church. That maybe warm is the new cool that we should be seeking after. And the great news about that is that any church can be warm. And any generation, any aged person can be warm. It's about making space in our lives for other people. It's about taking time to hear people's stories and to make them feel welcomed and embraced. Warmth is about learning each other's names. Warmth is about being seen and being heard. And in particular, when you get into talking with young adults, talking with, maybe college-aged or 20-somethings, this experience of loneliness and isolation is pervasive. And if you've got young people around, or whether they're in your church or in your community, for a lot of young people, in particular, a lot of young single people, which today most people in their 20s are single, the experience of sitting at somebody's table and sharing a meal can be profound. The experience of just being invited in to somebody's life, in particular, somebody of another generation or a family or an older couple or individual or a small group that, maybe extends just a little bit beyond their typical demographic. We talked to young people. I remember one young woman saying that the older women's Bible study in her church reached out and invited her. And it's the best thing that's ever happened to her because these women in their 70s and 80s are just loving on her. And it's a profound experience. I think people are dying for connection in our society, and the church is uniquely postured to offer that kind of connection.
That's a great segue into this book that you have co-authored called Growing Young, 6 Essential Strategies to Help Young People Discover and Love Your Church. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that research was like?
For sure. So I've shared a little bit of the findings already. We set out, largely because in our work with churches, we heard a lot of question around how do we address the graying and aging in our church? How do we address the phenomenon that the church is demographically, a lot of churches are shifting and they are struggling to engage young people. Yeah. And at the same time, we saw a lot of churches that were really thriving, the churches that were doing well, churches that engage a lot of young folks. And so we set out to find those churches. We wanted to know who are the churches that are bucking the trends, that are not following, maybe the typical patterns of the church in America. And they're really engaging those younger generations well. So over 250 churches were nominated to be part of that study. We tracked them over several years.
Wow.
We did phone interviews. We visited churches in person. And we really just learned so much through churches letting us into their community life and letting us see, some of the things that were happening there. And so this factor of warmth was one of those findings from that study, the involvement of young people and the ways that churches are prioritizing young people everywhere. So this was one of the things we found, was that churches aren't prioritizing young people just by putting programs in place for age level programming,
right?
But they're thinking about young people across the life of the church. And so, whoever's responsible for thinking about worship is also thinking about young people. Whoever's thinking about missions and service in the community is thinking about young people. Whoever's thinking about facilities is thinking about young people. And this kind of prioritization, it's a game changer because it makes those younger generations heard and seen in a way that doesn't isolate them, but also doesn't isolate other generations. Because in these same churches, older adults say, we may sometimes have to give up some of our preferences, or, there's been some give and take, but we don't feel marginalized by an emphasis and a priority on young people. But this emphasis has brought vitality and life, and we wouldn't trade anything for that.
I love that, Brad. I love all of the work that you're doing there at the Fuller Youth Institute. Like you said, it had been about a dozen years since Sticky Faith had been published, and coming up on 3 years now for Growing Young. I'm curious about the feedback that you've been getting as an impact from these books. Are there churches that are reporting to you that they've been able to make some of these changes and have seen a significant impact as a result?
Yeah, great question. So we've been working with churches through year-long cohorts. We've also been doing some consulting, and we've heard a lot of stories from churches. And what's really fun is we find that when churches are taking some intentional steps to look at everything they're doing and wonder, gosh, are we really listening to young people? Are we really prioritizing them? Let's ask young people themselves. Maybe one of the most profound things we've heard from churches is one of the core commitments that these churches held in common: empathizing with today's young people, really taking time to listen, to see, to try to understand some of those generational differences. And we've had churches say to us, we thought we were empathizing with young people, but when we really took time to listen, when we really made space and sat down with teenagers or with young adults and listened to their stories and asked them some questions about, how's our church doing here? How well do you feel understood? And we realized that we hadn't actually been doing that.
Wow.
We realized that there was a real gap between our perceived connection with young people and how they were actually feeling seen and heard and known. And that difference has made a huge difference. Taking that step of listening and asking. We also put together an assessment that churches can take. And we found that's been a really effective way for churches to listen well to all generations, because people can participate in that assessment in a way that's confidential. And so they can sort of give their honest feedback. And it's really interesting to look at the ways different generations within a church, the same church, might perceive things a little bit differently. And I think that's helped some churches have some really great conversations around not only young people in their church, but also, how other generations are feeling. And churches can get really good at focusing on particular things over others. And sometimes it's focusing on particular generations. A lot of our churches were crafted really well for baby boomers.
Yeah.
A lot of our programming works really well for Gen Xers. How much do our churches and our programming need to shift over time as generations change? Those are the kind of questions that churches need to be asking in every generation, not just this particular moment. But because of changes in our culture and society, I think this is a particularly pressing moment to ask those questions.
Yeah. I love the idea of a church assessment, because we think sometimes if we could just be honest enough with ourselves that maybe we can get to the root of what's missing or what we're maybe doing wrong or that we could be doing better. But actually asking the other generation how they feel and how much they are being empowered and involved in the church rather than just relying on our own perceptions is very helpful. I think that between cohorts and assessments, and especially reading your work, there is so much that churches can be doing, including ours, to continue to do both intergenerational work as well as empower our young adults and youth. So we have another question for you about not just the work that you've done previously, but what you're currently working on. Are there any projects that you currently have coming up?
Yeah, we have a number of projects underway. I'll just speak to a couple of them. We have a couple of grants right now looking at innovation in ministry, and we're working with churches, sort of a next phase to say, okay, if we sense that we need to make some changes, how could we really innovate around ministry to today's teenagers and young adults? So we have two different cohorts going that are around innovating practices in youth ministry and in young adult ministry. And I'll tell you, without being too evasive, honestly, the secret to all of that is empathizing well, really listening, really digging into, okay, what are the stories that our young people are telling themselves? And if we could imagine them going deeper in life with Jesus in our church community, how would we be helping them answer those questions? And then what kind of practices would we need to do together in order to really facilitate that kind of journey? So it's really, really exciting work. We also right now have a new parenting book coming out by two of my colleagues, Steve Argue and Kara Powell, our executive director, called Growing With. And this is a follow-up in many ways to Growing Young. And it's a book for parents. And in particular, parents of kids who are in the teenage or emerging adult or even the later 20s. The book addresses all three of those phases. And it asks the question, how can we not just grow apart as our kids grow up, but grow together? And what does it look like for parents to grow with our kids? And I got to tell you, my oldest is a junior in high school right now. And as soon as we got a copy of this book, I took it home to my wife and said, we need to have these conversations. How can we keep growing with our kids, both our own spiritual formation, but also our formation as people? And, so much about parenting in the teenage and young adult phase is about being the kind of person who both your kid wants to model their life after, but also who's modeling growth across the lifespan and modeling, gosh, my life is different because of you. You get to change who I am. And that is a significant part of what it means to be family. And we're just thrilled to get this resource out there and excited about the kinds of conversations that it's going to generate in families and in churches.
Yeah, I think my parents would say, having a child who's 17 and also two children who are in their 30s, that parenting young adults is just as hard, if not harder, than their teenagers.
Oh, for sure. And, parenting doesn't end. It just changes.
Yeah,
and
that's exactly
our
right.
Relationship needs to change, right? And it needs to change in order to stay healthy.
Yeah.
And we don't have great guides for that in our culture. So, quick, funny story. We were talking about college the other day, and I forget the exact example, but something came up. And my daughter said, yeah, are you going to be one of those motorcycle parents? And I was like, wait, do you mean helicopter parents? She's like, yeah, whatever. And so we decided that our new goal is to be motorcycle parents.
That's good. I like that.
We're going to define that as we go, but it sounds way better than helicopter parents.
Yeah.
So, Brad, we have one question that we ask each one of our guests, and it is this. At this point in your life, what's one thing you wish someone would have told you?
Adulthood can be more fun than it looks when you're a teenager. And I say that because I remember looking at adults and thinking, ugh. You know, is that what life looks like? And I think our culture really idolizes adolescence and sort of this imagined teenage dream, right? We just obsess over youthfulness. And I have met so many adults who've inspired me to be a flourishing adult and an adult who's growing. You know, people who inspire me to continue to pursue Jesus and pursue other people and to get healthier as I get older and just to experience rich life. And so I think let's be adults who young people want to become. I just think there's so much more, especially in living the Christian life. Man, abundant life can be a really beautiful thing. And I think young people look at our lives and aren't very inspired sometimes. Yeah. And I want to change that narrative.
What a great answer. I love that. We get a variety of answers when we ask that question. That was just really profound. I love it.
Absolutely.
Well, hey, Brad, it has been an absolute pleasure having you join us today. We thank you for your time.
Yeah, so fun. Thank you for the invitation.
And we look forward to reading those upcoming books coming out and being educated each time Fuller Youth Institute comes out with something new. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I love what Brad said about abundant life and this challenge that we have as adults within the church to show our youth and to show our children that Christianity isn't just some boring, gimmicky thing that we do just because we do it, but that we're actually a part of a family that is life transforming and that God calls us and challenges us into the adventures of the world. And there's just so much more to this Christianity thing than sometimes we observe on a Sunday morning. And so I love that challenge. And along those lines, we want to leave you with a verse, something that Jesus said that changes the way we think about our lives.
So that scripture today comes from John 10, verse 10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it or go online and leave a comment or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or Spotify to not miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at fumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Brad Griffin for joining us this week. And make sure and tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Kate Wallace Nunnally. Have a great week.